If you're like me, you love the color, the contrast, and the texture of film. So you go out and buy your favorite film stock, shoot a full roll of 36 photos, only to open the back of the camera and realize the film never rolled back into the canister. It's completely heartbreaking because those photos are now lost forever. And even when shooting film does work, with film prices going up, lab scans being inconsistent, trying to travel with film is just a nightmare, or just the time and patience it takes to shoot film just isn't always practical. So in today's video, I'm going to show you how you can create that dreamy pastel film look digitally, no matter your camera. And to achieve this, you need to understand 3 key things that make up that film look: contrast, color, and texture. But before we jump into Lightroom, we first have to understand why film looks the way it does, and how exposing, developing, and scanning all affect the final image, creating a lot of film variables. So real quick guys, I personally believe we can very closely emulate that film look in Lightroom, but we'll never truly replace or replicate film with digital, and here's a few reasons why. This is a film negative I scanned here in the studio using a mirrorless camera next to the same negative scan by 2 separate labs. Notice how wildly different the contrast and the colors look. And that's my first point. There's just so many different variables and inconsistencies when you get your film scanned by different labs, as they have their own color and contrast correction process, so it's not a very accurate base to work from. And guys, if you've actually seen this photo before, well, you have, as it actually wasn't shot on film, it was shot on my Sony mirrorless camera. Let me explain. I used a process called DFD, where you upload a digital file to a website and they send you back a film negative. So guys, use this method if you want to get that exact film look. But my next point is how exposing film changes the color, the contrast, and the texture of the image. Here's a quick test I did with Kodak Gold 200. 1 frame underexposed, 1 at the correct exposure, and 1 overexposed by 1 stop. And look at the difference, especially in that color and that contrast. Underexposed film has a crunchier contrast. You also get much more grain in the image, and notice the black point in the histogram giving you this faded look. Now, when you compare it to the overexposed frame, which has more pastel tones, a dreamier contrast, and even the skin tones has picked up a bit of warmth. Also, when you compare different film stocks, there's not a massive difference in color and contrast. Kodak's color science, for example, leans warm and pastel across most of their C41 films. And then finally guys, film actually prefers more light than advertised, meaning that you can overexpose by over 2 stops and still get a great image, meaning film has a lot more latitude and detail in the highlights and whites compared to the shadows and blacks. You'll also notice if you look at that histogram, film typically doesn't reach the complete black or white point in the image. So guys, this is all really important information to understand when we go to edit in Lightroom. We're not just emulating the color, we're going to shape the contrast and the texture as well to match that film look. So let's quickly jump into Lightroom and show how I get this dreamy pastel film look digitally. So guys, today I want to show you how to get a generic film look, but I'll be dropping some tips for when you want to emulate other film stocks like Portra 400 or Kodak Gold, and which way these film stocks tend to lead towards, especially in the color. But the first step is the beautiful contrast and the limited dynamic range of film, which we achieve in the tonal adjustments and the tone curve. And if you guys get confused about the theory of this step, I have made a dedicated video about the tone curve, which is linked in the description down below. So the first step I like to do is I like to crop my photo, and I like the aspect ratio of 4:3 as it really does emulate the look of shooting on medium format film, especially like my Pentax 645. So we learned before that film actually has a lot of detail in the highlights and not much detail in the shadows. We also don't have a true white point, and also we don't have much black in film images. Now real quick guys, if you notice when I'm moving this black slider, notice notice how the blacks never actually detach in the histogram from the black point. And to get this faded black look that we find in film, we have to use the tone curve. And you'll notice that if we bring up the black point here in the tone curve, it's moving it away from the histogram. And then also we want to fade out the whites a little bit as well to bring them away from the histogram. And then now you'll see that we have this very flat, unattractive contrast, and we've sucked all the life out of this raw file. So now we just want to add a gentle S-curve to add the contrast back in. Again, I've got a video explaining all this in detail, link down below. And I want to bring up my highlights and the tone curve a little bit higher, and I want to crush the shadows a little bit more because we know we've got limited dynamic range in the blacks and shadows and more dynamic range and detail in the highlights and the whites. And once we've dialed in the tone curve and the tonal adjustments, I like to just use the contrast slider to add in a little bit of extra contrast. And you'll see that when you're moving the contrast slider, it mainly only affects the mid-tones. So I just like to add quite a little bit of extra contrast in my film shots personally. So that is the generic tone, the contrast, and dynamic range that we see in film. Now we're going to jump into how to get those pastel-y, beautiful film colors. So the first thing I do is I start with the color calibration and the color wheels as a base for this film look, and I really dial in the colors with the HSL sliders that I'll show you now. So what we're going to do is we're going to slide all the way to the bottom in Lightroom to the color calibration tab. And I'll start in the red primary. I've noticed that the reds tend to be a little bit more orange, so I'm going to bring these up to about +15 or so, and the red channel is slightly desaturated to about -8 will do today. Now the green primary, if you want to edit like Kodak Gold, you need to pull it to the left because Kodak Gold adds a little bit of yellow in the green, but I actually prefer the greens in Portra 400, which tend a little bit more towards blue. And then I find that most film stocks have desaturated the greens by quite a bit. And then the blue primary, I typically see most film stocks tending a little bit more teal. Again, Portra 400 is a little bit more on the magenta side, which I'll show you how to correct shortly. And then again, the saturation is relatively low, around -10. And then finally, I see a lot of film stocks just having a small amount of green tint into the shadows. This is more noticeable on cinematic films like Kodak's Vision 3 or Cinestill 800T. And I also notice that in the shadows of a lot of my film photos, even when the white balance has been corrected, you end up with a bit of a blue tealy look to the shadows as well. So to achieve this, we need to go up to the color wheels. And in the color wheels, we have the shadows, the midtones, and the highlights. And I prefer clicking each individual wheel and working with them individually. So I find majority of film stocks has a bit of a bluey teal color cast in the shadows around that 200 mark. And then I find the saturation around 7 to 10. Moving on to the midtones here, I find a little bit of a cheat code if you set this to around 55 or so, and then saturation between 5 and 8. This really does correct the skin tones and just gives you that pleasant skin tones that you see in a lot of film images. And then finally onto the highlights. And I find film stocks like Portra 400 just have a very slight amount of magenta into the highlights. And I find cheaper film stocks like Lomo 400 or Kodak Gold Ultramax tend to have a bit of warmth in the highlights as well. But I prefer this magenta look into the highlight. So now we have our base with our color wheels and our color calibration. It's time to move up into the HSL slider, and we have our hue, saturation, and luminosity. So I'm going to start with the hue, and the red, orange, and yellow are really your skin tones. So I don't actually move these too much, as I feel that the skin tones in film is quite neutral, but it does tend to be a little bit more on the orange side compared to red. As well as the orange, it actually tends to be a little bit more yellow. And then the yellow channel, I feel it adds a little bit of extra green, and this extra bit of green in the yellow channel actually removes some of that pinkish reddish tone from skin tones by adding a little bit of green. Now again, if you want to have cheaper film stocks, the green tends to be a little bit more warmer, but Portra 400 actually adds quite a lot of blue into the green channel to give you this unique green look. Aquas tend to be more teal, and then Portra 400 actually tends to be more magenta in the highlights, or Ecta 100, while cheaper film stocks actually tend to be more teal, and I definitely prefer that more teal look in my blues. Next we move on to saturation, and the red, orange and yellow channels actually have quite a bit of saturation in film to make everything pop. So I'm going to bring this up to about +10 or so, and then just a little bit in the yellows. The green channel, pretty much all film stocks are quite desaturated, as well as the aquas, and also the blue is relatively desaturated as well. And then lastly we have lumosity, and this is definitely the secret sauce in that film look. As you'll notice in film, you actually get a lot of density in the red channel compared to the orange and yellow, and I find the yellows are actually a little bit more lighter and brighter. The green in pretty much all films is very dark and dense, so I actually bring this right down. And the majority of film stocks actually have very bright and pastel-y blues, so I bring the lumosity up quite a lot. So you'll notice when you turn this on and off, we have now adjusted the colors that we want in film, but we're actually losing quite a bit of density and vibrance from desaturating everything in the HSL as well as the color calibration. So to adjust this, I use the vibrance and saturation, and I've shown this before on the channel that saturation affects the overall image, while with vibrance, it is saturating the colors that are desaturated and leaving the colors that have good saturation. So for me, I actually bring this pretty high to about 35, and then I'll actually bring the saturation down a little bit just to balance out the look. And then lastly is white balance. This is such an important part of that film look, and typically most film stocks are on the warmer side. So I'm just going to bring up my white balance and just notice how much more of the colors change when you start bringing up that temperature. And also I find that majority of film stocks have a little bit of extra magenta in them. And then for other film stocks like Cinestill 800T or Kodak Vision 3, which is a motion picture film, the white balance is very cool and also very green. So that is the contrast and color of film. Next we need to adjust that beautiful texture that we get, and this isn't just referring to that grain slider in Lightroom. Now a lot of people say that you have to use a mist filter to really emulate and sell that film look, and that's kind of true, because if you shoot film on an older lens you will get a mistier, softer look, but if you shoot film on a medium format with a modern lens and a modern camera, you actually get very clean and clinical results. So me personally, that's why I don't use mist filters, as I can just adjust the texture and emulate that bloomy film look in Lightroom. So this step on texture isn't just about the grain, there's actually quite a few steps to really sell that film look, which I'll show you now. So I'm going to start with the texture clarity and dehaze to really sell that misty look, and this is the reason why I prefer not to shoot with mist filters, as this is referred to non-destructive editing. So I'm going to zoom in so you guys can see how this affects the image, and you can see that we've got a very clinically sharp and digital image. So to remove this, I actually remove quite a bit of texture from the image, around -20 to -15, and then I'll add a slight amount of negative clarity, which really gives you that more blooming effect. If you go too much, you get more. If you go less, it's more subtle. And then also the dehaze slider actually makes things look a lot more softer and as if you're shooting on a vintage lens. So that right there is going to add a little bit of extra softness to the photo and really sell that film look. Next, I want to quickly scroll down and just turn off all of the sharpening. This is on default in Lightroom, so make sure you turn that off. Another thing about film, especially on older lenses, is that you will actually get quite a bit of vignetting. So I'm going to bring this down to around -25 or so, and then I like to bring the midpoint down to about -45. And then we move on to probably the most important step that really does sell that film look, and that is the grain. So again, I'm just going to zoom in so we can see what we're doing here, and I actually like to bring this up to about 30, which is relatively low to some people, and I love the grain out of Portra 400, so I'm going to bring this size amount down to about 20, and then I like finer grain, so I'm going to bring this down to about 40. If you want to emulate a cheaper film stock, really bring that roughness up and you can really see more grain. It really does sell that grain look, compared to if we just bring this down to 40 or so and we bring up the grain amount. It doesn't really look the same. It looks too much and just looks too artificial. And then lastly, my last step is I actually like to boost the exposure quite high, and you'll notice that when you do this you actually get more pastel-y colors compared to when you underexpose film. And then guys, this is my final tip that really does sell that film look, especially when you're printing or sharing your photos online. And this comes down to your export settings. When you get a film scan back from the lab, it's typically in JPEG, but the quality from a standard scan isn't amazing. So I actually bring this down to about 80 or so, and I'll actually limit the file size to 2 megabytes. And then I also scroll down and I resize to fit. I select the long edge and I'll reduce this to about 2000 pixels wide, and this really does make the image a lot more softer. And then I'll actually change my output sharpening for matte paper and select the low amount and then hit export. Alright guys, I just want to quickly show you that this look can be applied to any photo, no matter the camera brand as well. So down here I have 2 separate photos, and what I'm going to do is go back to the original photo. I go Command A, which selects all the photos. I come down here and click sync, and I make sure that white balance exposure is not ticked. I turn off lens correction, and I leave the aspect ratio for the cropping but turn off the straighten angle. And if I go synchronize, and then all I need to do is slightly just adjust that crop, come in and adjust the exposure, do the white balance to taste, and then call it a day. And then you can see this formula works across any different skin type. So here is a before and here's an after. Here's another photo, but this one was taken on Fujifilm, and all I'm going to do is just boost that exposure to get more pastel-y colors, add a little bit extra warmth and a slight amount of magenta, and then call it a day. And if you like this look, you can actually create a preset. Just make sure you've unticked the white balance and exposure, lens correction, and then click create. And then if you really want to emulate some different film stocks and support me, I do sell Lightroom presets. So here is the Portra 160 preset. I've got an HP5 preset, and for this one I like to make a little bit more darker. And then I also have my favorite, which is Astia Soft, and then we're just going to bring up that exposure. I also have different mist effects, so depending on the strength that you want to go for, and I also have different grain presets as well. If you like the way that I edit my photos, go check out my Lightroom presets, which are linked down below. These work across all major camera brands, and if you sign up to my newsletter, you'll receive 20% off your first order. Alright guys, so that's my secret recipe to getting that dreamy pastel film look. Editing is only 10%, while going out to shoot is 90% of the process. So if you want to learn how to get the best colors out of your camera, despite your camera brand, go check out this video right here. And if you are a little bit unsure about the difference between the tone curve and the tonal adjustments, definitely go check out this video right here that did well. Again, if you did get any value out of this video, make sure you hit that like button and make sure you subscribe, and we will see you in next week's video.